Welcome to another program from Jim Hinckley's America. Today's program is Era of Innovation, Bathtubs, Bird Cages, and Buick. Jim Hinckley's America. Our cornerstone, our foundation is sharing America's story and inspiring road trips by telling people where to go. Changing times. That's an understatement. The 1880 to 1880 to 1930 period is a period of just absolute dramatic transformation, especially in the realm of transportation and related technologies. And that story, of course, begins a lot earlier than most people realize. 1760s, we put the first steam-powered vehicle on the road. It was a cantankerous, it was a horrible outfit, but it worked. Stunned the world. But it wasn't going to replace the horse. We had people experimenting with internal combustion engines before the War of 1812. We started having internal combustion engines for industrial applications as early as 1823. And the first known petrol-powered vehicle was 1882 in Italy. And Carl Benz in Germany in 1885 is credited with creating the first somewhat practical automobile. Eh, The cornerstone, if you would, the foundation for the American auto industry, for the gosh, for the national highway system, and for a lot of the things that we deal with today, for better or for worse, even airplanes, started with the bicycle. Uh, Thomas Stevens went around the world on one of those big penny farthing bicycles, the kind of contraption that was conceived as a means for committing suicide while you're out recreating for good health. He rode one of these penny farthing bicycles, the big front wheel, small back wheel, around the world. And the articles he wrote became a book, a best selling book. And it inspired people to really get out on their bicycles and explore. People had already been doing that here in the States. In 1878, we had a bicycle club organized in Boston. And by the early 1880s, we had bicycle clubs all over the United States. Uh, Elmer Lovejoy in Laramie, Wyoming, established a bicycle club and was organizing trips to Cheyenne and Casper and Denver and to the Yellowstone. He rode a bicycle. He started producing bicycles in Laramie, Wyoming, and rode a bicycle to the Chicago Exposition to show off and market his bicycle. That was 1893. Keep in mind that Geronimo did not surrender to American troops until 1886, and the Wounded Knee Massacre took place in 1890. One of the big game changers for bicycles was 1885. John Kemp came up with a Rover. This is basically a modern bicycle. Same size front and rear wheels and chain drive. Um, Bicycles just were a magnet for visionaries, tinkerers, inventors. One of those fellows was Isaac Johnson, an African American inventor. He came up with the idea for a folding traveler's bicycle. Well, this gave bicycle clubs a real boost. They could jump on the train, take their bicycle, let the adventure begin. And we started marketing bicycles to women. This was a revolutionary change, to say the very least. Here's a little tidbit. My pa said it's better to fill the head with useless knowledge than no knowledge at all. In 1897, Hosea Libby introduced an electric assist bicycle. Mr. Stevens, like I say, he sparked. I would give him credit for kind of igniting a passion for road trips. Just road trips for fun, for no other reason, just to get out and go. Bicycle mania in the 1880s and 1890s can't be understated. United States, Europe specifically, both were tandem bicycles, bicycle racing, bicycle touring. Uh, People were just obsessed with bicycles. Louis Chevrolet, before he immigrated to the United States, he started working in a bicycle company, and then he started racing bicycles. And then he became a bicycle manufacturer. The Wright brothers, they had a bicycle shop. A lot of the early automobile manufacturers started out with bicycles, and a lot of the early racers started out with bicycle racing. Just to give you a quick idea, 1890 we had 27 bicycle companies in the United States producing about 40,000 bicycles. This bicycle railroad I mentioned here is a tourist attraction. It was a major tourism attraction. Interestingly enough, I was just reading about something similar in California that just recently opened, where they're taking miles of old rail lines through the woods there in the Pacific Northwest, and they're putting people out on pedal operated rail cars. Anyway, by 1896, we had over 500 companies producing more than 1 million bicycles. And the same thing was happening in Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, even in Russia. Uh, Pretty astounding when you really think about this. Albert Pope is kind of an interesting fella here. He took a General Motors approach to bicycles. We'll talk more about Mr. Pope in a moment. In 1897, it's estimated that 10% of all newspaper and magazine advertisement was for bicycles. But it wasn't just advertisement. Most of the major newspapers, magazines, they had bicycle editors. They would write about bicycle events, touring, racing, developments, fashion. Most importantly, they had whole sections now dedicated to women. That was something new. That was a societal transformation. But at the same time that the bicycle is evolving, developing, and transforming personal transportation, imagine for the first time, for less than the price of a horse, and less than the maintenance of a horse, you could buy a bicycle, you could travel faster than you could walk, and you were free from railroad timetables. While this was all taking place, another type of personalized transportation was appearing on the scene. And this is the automobile, which would soon eclipse the bicycle. I mentioned Albert Pope. He started out like a lot of the manufacturers that went into bicycles and automobiles, something totally unrelated. He was producing household products, wash tubs and washboards and things of that nature. In 1877, he designed a bicycle, but did not have the manufacturing facilities to produce them successfully. He partnered with a sewing machine company and distributed them through his Pope Manufacturing Company stores. Well, just like with GM would in future years, Pope began buying out bicycle manufacturers, established the American Bicycle Company, and he began offering a bicycle for every need and every budget. But he could see the handwriting on the wall, and so he got in on automobiles, specifically electric automobiles. Partnered with a company and began producing electric taxis for New York City and other locations. And then, as he started moving deeper and deeper into automobile manufacturing, he started buying up all these automobile companies and doing the same thing he did with the American Bicycle Company. Pope Toledo, Pope Tribune, Pope Waverly, Pope Hartford, all these different automobile companies. George Selton had patented an internal combustion engine in the United States in a four-wheel car. But he didn't do much with the patent. He kind of sat on it. And took him a while to get it set, 1895, kind of timely, because the automobile was coming into being. When companies started manufacturing automobiles with gasoline engines, Mr. Selden started demanding a royalty or he was going to sue, claiming he had the patent. And he became a little big for his britches. He was doing quite well, the Selden patent. You had to have a Selden license to produce automobiles. And he started restricting who could get a license. Henry Ford didn't qualify, meet his standards. Henry Ford sued. And he continued producing automobiles without a Selden patent. It took quite a few years, but Henry Ford beat Mr. Selden. And it's probably a good thing. The automobile industry would have been severely restricted if Mr. Selden had been allowed to have a stranglehold on it. The Duryea brothers became the first manufacturing company in the United States to produce a motor wagon, an automobile for sale. But what is an automobile? Montgomery Ward said it's a fad you need to see, take the children to see before it passes. And in 1896, the Barnum and Bailey Circus gave a Duryea motor wagon top billing over the albino, the fat lady, and the dog-faced boy. Ransom E. Olds, true pioneer we'll talk about in a few minutes, he established the Olds Motor Vehicle Company in 1897. Haynes Apperson was another pioneering company that got in on this. Studebaker, they began testing their first motor vehicle. Interestingly enough, it was an electric designed by Thomas Edison. They began producing in 1902. Studebaker, like a lot of companies, had started out, their big money came, one of the brothers went to the California Gold Rush and began making wheelbarrows. Then they began manufacturing wagons just in time for the Overland Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail trade routes, and people moving west, the migration. By the 1870s, Studebaker was one of the largest manufacturers of wheeled vehicles in the world. And even though they started producing automobiles, and by the early teens, they were one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the United States, they continued producing horse-drawn vehicles into the 1920s. I mentioned Mr. Olds earlier. He had been experimenting with steam-powered vehicles as early as 1880, and we had a problem on the streets, the cities, the major cities. New York, I mentioned in a previous program that New York had what they called the manure crisis. Millions of pounds of horse manure on the streets, urine, dead horses. Interestingly enough, Ransom Olds, he was convinced that the automobile was the solution for urban pollution. But Olds was quite a case study, and he was not alone. There was dozens and dozens of these type of people getting into the auto industry at this time. And you know about Henry Ford, and we'll talk about David Buick and Walter Chrysler and some of these other fellows here soon. But to give you a snapshot, Mr. Olds began building his first steam-powered car in 1884, and then he turned to gasoline. And he's come up with the first assembly line to produce automobiles. There was a hostile takeover, complicated stock deal. Olds was pushed out of his company, lost control of his name. So he simply started another company using his initials, R.E. Olds. The REO Motor Company would go on to produce some amazing cars like the Flying Cloud in the early 1930s. Had about a 100,000-mile warranty on the drivetrain. And the company would produce over-the-road big tractor rigs, tractor trailer rigs for into the 60s. But a lot of people don't realize that Mr. Olds is credited with creating the first gasoline-powered lawnmower. Like my pa said, better to fell the head with useless knowledge than no knowledge at all. He pioneered programs for immigrants, helping them learn language and the skills they needed here. Had an educated workforce. He pioneered all kinds of different social programs such as that. And in 1916, he created Oldsmar in Florida. And it was kind of a retirement area for former employees that got too old to work in Michigan. He had small light factories like broom companies, things of that nature, where people could still work, still make a living, and enjoy a little bit of warmer weather. In the teens, there were three premier luxury companies, and they were called, it was the three P's. It was Packard, Pierce Arrow, and Peerless. Pierce Arrow is a great case study. I mentioned previously that people started off in one industry and then evolved into something different, automobile manufacturing. And Pierce Arrow is an example. They started out as a manufacturer of bird cages and bread boxes and things of that nature. George Pierce bought out his partners and began building bicycles. And then in 1900, they started seeing the future. First, he tinkered with steam cars. He quickly realized the limitations of steam power. And like a lot of inventors and visionaries, he cleaned house and began manufacturing a single-cylinder automobile. And as I mentioned, by the teens, is one of the leading luxury car manufacturers in the world. Here's a surprise for you. David Buick. He was an immigrant. And by 1875, he had created quite a little empire for himself in Plumbing supplies. A lot of people don't know this. Here's another one for you, an opportunity to fill your head with a little bit of useless knowledge. David Buick came up with the method for fixing porcelain to cast iron. He gave us the cast iron bathtub. And at one point, he had one of the largest plumbing supply manufacturing facilities and sale in Detroit. But he was a curious fella with diverse interests and began experimenting with gasoline engines and developing them. Came up with a pretty revolutionary valve and head engine, and he sold his plumbing business so he could start focusing on automobiles. By 1900, it was obvious. People were just a mania for automobiles. It was the future. It was like a gold rush. Everybody wanted in on this. Frank and Benjamin Briscoe had made quite a fortune in Detroit as sheet metal manufacturers. Benjamin Briscoe wanted to get in on the automobile business. And so he ended up bankrolling David Buick and helping establish the Buick Motor Car Company. It didn't go as planned. More on that a little bit later. Even today, people are aware of Stanley steamers. And but what they're not aware of is the brothers, identical twins, who loved to play practical jokes. They also had a diverse array of business interests and contributed to an American icon, if you will. At age 9, the brothers developed the means for refining maple syrup, and they launched their first successful business endeavor. They loved music, and they learned how to produce violins. One of the brothers both brothers got into teaching. One brother developed a deep fascination for photography, got his brother involved, came up with a process, the first successful airbrush for photography, and then they patented a dry plate photographic process that revolutionized photography. And as they started tinkering with automobiles, they sold this for funding. They sold it to George Eastman, a fellow who owned a little company called Kodak. The brothers came up with a pretty decent steam car, but they needed more money, so they had some investors approach them about buying their patents and their company. They didn't want to sell, so they put the price, what they thought was just ridiculous. Much to their surprise, the investors ponied up the money. That company was reorganized as Locomobile, and the Stanley brothers went on and created the Stanley Motor Carriage Company. Steam cars by 1967, they were already antiquated, outdated, but Stanley's persevered. The Stanley steamer was produced into the 1920s, and in the early years, 5, 6, 7, and 8, they set astounding speed records in 1906 at Ormond Beach in Florida, now Daytona Beach. One of the Stanley cars was driven to nearly 150 miles an hour. So many of these companies started out with completely diverse interest in manufacturing. Firearms manufacturers became producers of automobiles. In New York City, a manufacturer of pianos transitioned into automobiles. Now, I didn't say they all transitioned successfully. One of the companies that did really well, and Cunningham, limited production, but they were in business from 07 to 36. Of course, Checker. They started out as a manufacturer of pants, for God's sakes. Jackson is an interesting study. The first one was they started out as an agricultural implement company. That was their origins, and then got into bicycles, things of that nature. They started out with a steam car, JAXON. That was a short-lived endeavor. Then they went to the JACKSON gas company, and that was produced from 03 to 23. And interestingly enough, the Jackson, to give you an idea on the steam cars, the Jackson was marketed as the car so easy to operate, a child or woman could drive it. By the late teens, the company was actually even producing a wide array of vehicles, including four-wheel drive trucks. I mentioned earlier that Studebaker had evolved from carriage and wagon building into automobiles. A lot of companies started that way. Deal Automobile Company out of Jonesville, Michigan, for example, was a leading manufacturer of horse-drawn wagons, horse-drawn sleighs, and they got into automobiles. Didn't work too well. Company kind of faded out. But one of the more interesting of these companies made this transition was the Patterson Greenfield Automobile Company. To the best of my knowledge, this is the only company that was established and operated and managed as an automobile manufacturing enterprise by an African American family. And the evolution, how the patriarch of the family was born into slavery, and then the company evolved and developed, is fascinating. Unlike a lot of these early companies, they did not fade on the vine. They realized quickly they could not compete with the big companies like Hudson and United States Motor Company, General Motors, Ford. So they slowly moved from automobile production into specialized construction of automobile bodies. And they survived well into the early years of the Great Depression. J. Walter Christie, here's another case study in innovation. He was convinced that front wheel drive was the only real practical automobile drivetrain. So he started working on this as early as 1906, building race cars, and tested and patented front wheel drive systems. And this became, he had patents in the United States, Russia, Australia, Germany, France, and the UK. And he went on to begin producing with moderate success some other things like front wheel drive taxi cabs. One of the intriguing things was, okay, we're replacing the horse. You have a fire department with horse drawn fire trucks. How do you come up with the money to buy a fire truck? Christie had the idea. Keep your fire truck, just replace the horse with one of his front wheel drive traction units. He went on and perfected things like the bogie and track system that became used in Caterpillar tractors and tanks. Here's a picture of J. Walter Christie in one of his legendary front wheel drive race cars. The automobile industry in the first decades of the 20th century was an absolute gold rush. Every community in the United States wanted to get in on this. And it was fertile ground for eccentrics, visionaries, uh, gosh, grifters, stock manipulators. Some of the companies were flash in the pan. Others, like I mentioned, Jackson, they were in business for 20 years. But everybody, Enid, Oklahoma had a car company. Camden, New Jersey. St. Louis had over 114 automobile companies during these years. A little bit of a side trip. We haven't inspired a road trip yet with this program. Near Jackson, Michigan, Spring Arbor, Lloyd Ganton has a little private museum, but he's very generous to open it for people. Ye Old Carriage Shop. He has managed to accumulate cars from 16 of the 24 companies that operated in Jackson, as well as an impressive collection of Spartan radios and Coca-Cola memorabilia and gas pumps, all kinds of interesting things. That's one you need to add to your list if you find yourself in southern Michigan. William Durant is another interesting case study. He started out with horse-drawn vehicles, and Benjamin Briscoe had bought Buick, but Buick became a drain for Benjamin Briscoe. He could not get David Buick to produce a car they could sell. He wanted to experiment. Durant wanted to get in on the automobile business, so he ended up buying Buick from Briscoe. And Benjamin Briscoe had this brilliant idea that he had gotten, I guess, from Albert Pope, that there's too many car companies. There's dozens and dozens of car companies. Let's create a conglomerate that supplies trucks, cars, everything anybody needs, every budget. And he's put together, actually had meetings, Henry Ford, William Durant, Ransom Olds, Jonathan Maxwell. The idea was to create this conglomerate. Well, the deal fell apart. William Durant liked the idea, and he established this little company that he called General Motors. But Durant had a tendency to overextend himself a lot. And he almost ruined General Motors as early as 1910, and Durant was forced from the company. But he went to an old partner, Mr. Dort, And Durant had started the first factory-funded race team to promote Buick. And he had hired three brothers from Switzerland that were known as mechanics and race drivers: Louis Chevrolet, Arthur Chevrolet, and Gaston Chevrolet. And by 1911, Louis Chevrolet specifically, was a household name. He was recognized. So Durant went to Chevrolet and says, "Hey, I got an idea. I'll get the backing. I'll get the financing. Let's start a company using your name." It didn't work too well. They had opposing ideas what the car should be. Durant and Louis Chevrolet got into a heated battle. Chevrolet lost. He lost control of his name like Olds did, and Durant came out on top. And he used Chevrolet to regain control of General Motors. But once again, he overextended the company. And he went on and tried another General Motors type company, Durant. It enjoyed tremendous success for the first few years, then failed with the Great Depression. And he tried all kinds of things, but never, ever hair tonic and all kinds of things. And he died pretty much destitute. In 1916, there were just so many automobile companies. Can you imagine being an automobile dealer, used car dealer in these years, or selling parts? You got Locomobiles and Daniels and Cunninghams, Stutz, Jackson, Buicks, Austins, auto cars, electrics. Dixie Flyer built in Louisville, Kentucky. Franklin, Klein cars, Nationals. To give you an idea how rapidly American society was transformed, consider this. In 1909, we had 828,000 horse-drawn vehicles manufactured. In 1909, about 125,000 automobiles. We flipped that. In 20 years, we flipped this dramatically. But not just the vehicle manufacturing. Think of the infrastructure, what this did. Carriage makers, harness makers, blacksmith shops. All of these things were transformed. 1920, 2 out of 5 families have indoor plumbing, 3 out of 5 families own an automobile, and only 1 in 5 have electricity. Ford was, of course, the leader at this time. Here's a little figure for you. 61% of all vehicles sold in the world were Ford in these early years. Absolutely anybody with a box of tools and an idea could come up with an automobile. Milton Reeves, he came up with a variable speed transmission that was pretty revolutionary, a VST transmission like was used in the Dodge Caliber a few years ago. Good idea. 8 wheels to make the tires last longer, not a good idea. Neither was his 6-wheeled car. They tried 3-wheeled cars. They tried high wheelers. As late as 1910, we had companies like International and Sears building vehicles that were a blending of wagon and automobile for the poor roads at the time. I mentioned innovation and visionaries, people you've never heard of, independent thinkers. One of my favorite stories to tell is about Ralph Teeter. Ralph Teeter was incredible. Working with a cousin, his father owned and family had machine shops and things of that nature. And in 1902, Teeter, working with his cousin, he helped build a car from scrap parts that they would drive to school. He got incredibly, and when you hear the end of the story, you'll know why I said incredibly. He got an engineering degree. That took a lot of pull from his family to get him into school. But once he got there, he did it. And then we partnered with these families and created the perfect system, perfect circle piston ring company. In between, he tinkered, came up with some patents for torque converter automatic transmission, the electric razor. He kind of was responsible for that. Of course, cruise control is his big thing. And he was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame in 1988. The most amazing thing about Mr. Teeter, he had been injured as a child playing in his father's machine shop, and he was blind. We don't often hear about women in the auto industry, and there were a bunch of them doing things. Mary Anderson, Charlotte Bridgewood, they kind of get the credit for the first windshield wipers. We have a truck designer in the 1920s. She was a Society of Engineers. She worked for Mack Truck, Marie. Florence Lawrence was a leading movie star before 1910, and she was passionate for fast automobiles. She was a pretty damn good mechanic too. She came up with a lot of ideas. Fortunately, she didn't patent the things, but she did create a pretty successful mail order company and selling aftermarket auto parts. Raymond Louis at Studebaker, he was a visionary, and he hired women to design things like the beautiful artistic interiors of cars such as the mid 30s Hudsons. And then Harley Earl was another that truly understood the value of putting women into work in the design studios. And I mentioned Florence Lawrence. Here's just a little bit more about her. Uh, to tell you an idea, like 1912, she had a Lozier Knickerbocker Berlins. This is one of the most powerful cars at the time, $6,500. To give you an idea, a new Ford was just under $800. And she couldn't leave well enough alone, even though it was powerful. She modified the car and made it even faster. She's credited with creating the first brake light assembly and first turn signal devices. William Stout started out with aircraft design and coming up with some things. You can see it here. This they never got over very well, never made many of these, but the Stout Scarab, definitely the grandfather of the minivan. Movable seats, fold down seats, storage lockers, V8 engine, rear wheel drive with transaxle, very stable, obviously very aerodynamic. These were built in the 1930s. Here's a surprise for you. The Woods Electric Company, they began producing electric taxi cabs for Chicago and New York as late 1899. Interestingly enough, they were organized by board members of Standard Oil. How's that? One of our more intriguing cars was built in the 1915-16 period, the Woods Dual Power. It was a gas-electric hybrid advertised as a car that soils the air less. And by the 1920s, we've pretty much given up on steam cars. But not everybody. Abner Doble came up and solved most of the problems with steam cars. Primary issue was they were, as Jay Leno learned, getting burned recently with a steam car, trying to start them. They were complicated in the sense there was a lot of procedures you had to go through to light the burner, build steam. Abner Doble came up with a flash boiler system. Instead of 30 minutes to get a head of steam to move the car, you could do it basically 3 minutes. These cars were fast, they were durable, but they were ridiculously expensive, and so only a few of these were ever produced. Interestingly enough, another little footnote I've never understood, brake technologies seem to languish quite a lot. And Doble was one of these cars. They had rear wheel mechanical brakes. This was a heavy, powerful, and fast automobile. Detroit Electric was one of the most successful of the electric companies. They were in business into the 1930s. They were building electric postal vans. Ralph Nader would enjoy the seating arrangement. As you can see here, talk about being distracted drivers with texting. How about having the passenger sit next to you talk to you? There's another little bit of road trip inspiration for you. There's an embryonic museum in Kingman, Arizona at the Powerhouse Visitor Center. It's stage one of the world's first electric vehicle museum. It's right on Route 66 in Kingman. And the Historic Electric Vehicle Foundation is working with the city to actually create an experience, a museum, and educational center on the electric vehicles. Detroit Electric, like I say, they were in business 1907 to 1939. For obvious reasons, it wasn't promoted very much, but early gas cars were cantankerous difficult. Driving a Model T takes some getting used to say the very least. Before 1912, cars were crank started. So electric cars were heavily marketed towards women, and they became very popular with a female driver. Henry Ford and Walter Chrysler's wife had Detroit Electric automobiles. Detroit Electric proved that if a city had electricity, electric vehicles were very practical for urban transportation and use. Not much good for long distance. And I say if your city had electricity. Grants, New Mexico, for example, didn't have electricity until the 1920s. To give you a kind of a timeline on evolution, Henry Leland, he was a precision engineer. He had precision machinist, and he had apprenticed under Samuel Colt at Colt Firearms. He was instrumental in the formation of several companies. Cadillac, story I'm going to share with you in a future program, but he also created Liberty aircraft engines, which became Lincoln. I mentioned Benjamin Briscoe. Benjamin Briscoe was responsible for putting Buick on the map. And of course, Buick gave rise to General Motors. And then because Benjamin Briscoe sold Buick, he was able to create Briscoe. That came after the Maxwell Briscoe, which would evolve into Chrysler. Charles Nash, another story I will share in a future program. Nash is a great story. Rags to riches, smart fella. Started out as a cushion stuffer at Durant Dort Wagons, working with William Durant. Became president of Buick, became the head of General Motors, started his own company, Nash, began producing trucks under the Jeffrey four-wheel drive trucks under the Jeffrey name. I mentioned Durant Dort, Buick, Chevrolet, Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Oakland. These are all tied into William Durant. There's a personal connection to this story that I'd like to share with you. My grandfather was Frederick P. Hinckley. I never met the fella, but he was instrumental in this, what I'm doing here. He was born in 1865. He was 63 years old when my father was born, so I never met the gentleman. But he was a prolific inventor. He invented the coaster brake for the bicycle. He was a machinist for David Buick. And every time I go back to Michigan, I dig deeper and deeper into his story, and I found that he had a company called Hinckley Myers. This became Kent Moore Tool Company, manufactured an array of tools. And as I say, he patented the coaster brake for the bicycle. And he had a company called Hinckley Way Products and did special work for Henry Ford. And that's how this whole thing got started. It was a picture of my grandfather and Henry Ford on the front porch of my grandmother's house on Hinckley Boulevard in Vandercook Lake, Michigan. Well, I hope you found this of interest, and I hope you'll join us again for another program. And I hope that you will consider giving me a call. Let me spice up your next convention, your next event, your next fundraiser, and we'll come to your venue, come to your event, and we will share America's story. We'll inspire road trips by telling people where to go. Adios, amigos.